story on today's Faith and Culture. Welcome to this week's episode of Faith and Culture. I'm your host, Tre Goins-Phillips, and we're joined by our guest today, Jon Seidl. Jon, thanks for being here and coming on with us.
Thanks for having me, Tre. Excited to be here.
So you have a brand new book. It's called Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic. Tell us why you decided to write this book now.
Well, the short answer is God told me to, and I lost an argument with him. Because listen, I mean, the truth is, like, this is something that, I went through that I thought, you know what, I'll talk to individual people if they have, a problem, but I'm not going public with this. But really, like Jacob, I wrestled with God and lost. And, the Lord made it very clear that I think there's a lot of people who struggle with secret addictions, and not just substance addictions, right, Tre? Like, they can be pride, they can be porn, whatever. And I think in the Christian community, we have a box for the alcoholics who become Christians, the porn stars, the porn addicts who become Christians, but we don't know what to do with the Christians who succumb to ongoing sin as well and become addicts. And I just really felt a burden to write something that was especially for them. And so that's really what the book is about. It's about my journey being the Christian who became an alcoholic and crawling back to Jesus and having that story of messy sanctification that I think a lot of us have but don't want to admit. And so that's why I wrote the book.
You outline in the book when it comes to finding freedom and healing, there are 4 different steps, and one of them is that radical vulnerability that you talk about, and you definitely put it into practice in the book and in writing really a testimony of what has happened to you and how the Lord has redeemed those things in your life. So talk a bit about what hitting rock bottom was for you.
Yeah, exactly. You talk about radical vulnerability. It's not a fun story, but the truth is that in 2021, I wrote a book on faith and mental health. And that book did well. It became a bestseller on Amazon, top 100 book on all of Amazon. But, I written that book after I thought I went through the hardest moment and period of my life. What I didn't realize is I was about to go through the hardest period of my life. And so fall of 2021, I lose a big client. I had my own business at the time. After my book came out, I hit a depression. Our mutual friend and CBN personality, Billy Hallowell, said, "Hey, be careful because you'll have some expectations for this book that won't be realized, and you can feel kind of like a letdown." And I didn't heed that advice. And sure enough, I felt a huge letdown after the book, even though it did well. And then fast forward to the spring, and my son was diagnosed with a tumor in his shin. And while that ended up being benign, that process was just, heart-wrenching. And so all of those things happen, and I just slowly, and there's a chapter in the book called The Slow Fade, where I just slowly started turning to alcohol more and more, because here's the truth, Tre. Alcohol is a good numbing agent, right? It does help you escape. I couldn't turn thoughts and feelings off in my mind. I didn't want to face these issues. And so alcohol does help you escape. And so I just started drinking more and more. A nightcap at 8 became, 2 or 3 drinks at 5. 5 became 5 o'clock somewhere. And, before I know it, I'm having 5, 6, 7 drinks a night until I don't feel the things I don't want to feel. And in 2023, my wife and I went on a trip to Miami. Very long story short that I get into in the book, but I get drunk one night after promising her I would not get drunk. I end up in the ocean alone, going to the bathroom out of, both ends. And I kind of have this moment of clarity of like, what has my life become? And, get up the next day, lie to my wife about it. But the Holy Spirit just is wrecking me and working on me. Finally admit it to her. And she says, "You know what, Jon? I don't want you to promise to never drink again. What I want you to do is I want you to get to the root of why. I want you to get to the root of why you can't sit with your thoughts and emotions, why things are so uncomfortable, why you can't find healthy coping mechanisms." And I'm like, can we just go to the not drinking part? Like, I'd rather do that,
Yeah.
And yet that was the commitment I made. So I started seeing a Christian trauma therapist and really digging into, there are parts of ourselves, Trey, that we give over to God. And we say, Jesus, you can have this part of myself. And those parts of myself wrote a best-selling book on faith and mental health. But there are also parts of ourselves that are so wounded or hurt or traumatized that we don't want to look at them, let alone let Jesus into them, because then we have to face them and know that they're there, right? And so I'd walled off those parts of myself, and those unhealthy parts. When you face the hardest part of your life, you don't know what to do with them. You don't know what to do with those feelings and emotions. And I drank them away. And so that's what I dug into, like exposing all of those parts of myself to Jesus. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't fun. But man, as a result, I've gotten the best life possible. Not the easiest life, but the best life possible. And I'm finally, I think, in a healthy place with learning how to sit with my emotions and not drink them away.
Jon, something you touched on there in that answer, and also that you unpack in the book, is that addiction is often really, it's a Band-Aid to treat a much deeper wound. So tell us about that moment of hitting rock bottom and then doing the work of kind of parsing, okay, what is alcohol treating? What am I using it as a solution for? And what are some of the root causes that I have maybe not identified, or have identified, but have been too scared or uninterested in resolving?
Yeah. I say that my ultimate addiction, Trey, was not to alcohol. Even though there was a physical addiction there, right? Like when I stopped, I had withdrawal symptoms. But my ultimate addiction was to escapism. I wanted to escape. And the problem that I realized is going back to my childhood. I was sexually abused, physically abused, starting at the age of 6. And so at that point, you at 6 can't really make sense of that, right? And so what you do is you learn, if I can't physically get away from this, I need to mentally get away from this. I need to mentally check out. I don't want to sit and think about what just happened to me, right? And so what happened is these patterns of escapism took over. And so at 6, that's Tonka Toys and Barney. At 36, that's tequila and bourbon, right? And so what I realized is, because I had never fully processed these things, because I had never fully understood what it looked like to sit with uncomfortable emotions, to invite Jesus into these areas of my life, I just wanted to escape. So part of the work, as we call it, that I did was going back through and inviting Jesus into these whether it was even these traumatized memories, these traumatized experiences, forgiving myself, right? Seeking the forgiveness of the Lord, but also forgiving myself, right? Untangling the shame. Oh my goodness, right? Like, I think shame, and there's a whole chapter on this in the book, is one of the devil's biggest tools that he uses to keep us enslaved, right? So it's untangling the shame. And it was a year of that, man. It was every week for a year consistently. And guess what? I still go, right? It's not every week now, right? I've been able to taper it back, but I still go and see my therapist and talk through these things, because here's the truth. The devil still likes to whisper lies. And the lies that he spoke to me in 2021 are lies that go at those core woundings, right? When my book didn't do exactly what I thought it should do or wanted it to do, the devil whispers lies that go back to some of those things that happened to me at 6. People don't care about you. They don't see you. They're not going to take interest in you. They don't want to hear what you have to say. Like all of those things, right? The devil still tries to speak those lies. And guess what? He's found some new ones. He's found some new ones as well that I need to combat as well. So that's what going to the root of those things. And my wife said this to me once, and it was very profound. She said, Jon, you have to get to the root to get to the rot, right? And so those roots ran deep, and they ran through layers. right? There was cultural layer, there was spiritual layer, there was mental layer, like all of these things. And I had to untangle those things and get to the root and get through those layers to realize, okay, what really needs to be healed. And once I did that, then I found freedom.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's all good stuff. And everybody, stick with us. We're going to fit in a quick break. We'll be right back with more faith and culture in our conversation with Jon Seidl. Welcome back to this week's episode of Faith and Culture. We're joined by Jon Seidl and talking about the incredible testimony that the Lord is writing in his life. And Jon, you hitting rock bottom happened in 2023 and realizing, okay, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. This is something that I want to deal with. It's certainly your testimony and what God is doing in your life, but it's also a testimony of you and your wife and what the Lord is doing together with you as a family. So talk about the conversations that led you to y'all's decision to say, okay, I'm ready to share this testimony and share this radical vulnerability with the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've realized, and Trey, I know that you're newly married, so I think you probably realize this by now, but that the Lord, one of the ways the Lord speaks to me is through my wife. Yeah. And she's a wise, incredible woman. And what happened is, as I got through the first kind of 9 months, if you will, of sobriety and digging into the roots of why I was drinking the way I was, one of the steps that I talk about in the book, and so the first half is memoir, the second part is practical guide. And one of those practical steps is abiding in Christ. And so as I was abiding with Christ one morning, and I journal and I write down, he told me, like, this is your next book. And I said, no way, it is not. But I just kept feeling that. And so I went to my wife one morning and I said, hey, this is going to sound crazy. I don't know what to do with this. I know it would be hard, not just for me, but for you. But I feel like the Lord is telling me I need to write this book. And he literally gave me the title that day, Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic. That was the title from the beginning. And she goes, I have to tell you, the Lord's been telling me the same thing, but I've been too afraid to tell you because I don't know if you're ready. And I'm like, well, I don't know if I'm ready either, right? But I think what we both realized is that there needs to be, like, healing happens when we talk about our woundings, right? And I think there's a lot of books that are written by people 5, 10, 15, 20 years in their sobriety journeys. But what I felt a really strong burden is to, when I started writing this, I mean, I was only a year, maybe a year and a half into my sobriety journey. And some people use that against me. They're like, well, this is too soon. And I'm like, maybe, but the Lord told me to do it. And I'm really convicted that there's something, I think, greater that you get when someone writes about their journey, having been so close to that rock bottom moment, right? Like, I'm like, listen, I can still taste the bourbon. I can still feel those emotions. I can still remember so much of what that was like. And you don't get that from someone 20 years down the road. Yeah. And so my wife and I both really felt convicted about, like, yeah, this is the time. It's going to be hard. And my wife got full veto power. There's only one thing she told me that she didn't feel comfortable with me putting in the book. But, other than that, like, I try to pack it full because I think, Trey, Revelation talks that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And I think there is something so powerful that when we see other people's stories, we realize we're not alone. And so I wanted to include as many details, not gratuitously, but as many details as possible so that people would say, oh, I'm not alone, or, oh, me too, right? And so that's where the heart behind the book, and especially writing it so close to my sobriety date.
Yeah. Some people might see the title Christian Alcoholic, which you mentioned, as a bit controversial. So explain a bit about your motivation to use that phrase in particular.
Yeah, I went back and forth on that, right? Because I think in one sense, I can say, one of the reasons I didn't do a traditional 12-step program like AA is because I didn't want to be boxed into being the alcoholic for the rest of my life, right?
Yeah.
And yet I write a book with that's in the title. And here's what I came to, Trey. Two things. One, it's a way to keep me humble, right? Like, I know that I am one series of decisions away from being that person again, right? The moment I think that I am cocky enough to think that my sin is not something that can creep back in is the moment it starts creeping back in. So that's the first reason. The second reason is because there's two people I look at in the Bible that really inspire me on this front. One of them is Paul and one of them is Matthew. And so if you look at Paul, he's constantly reminding people what a scumbag he was, right? And I use that term like he's like, no, you don't realize I persecuted Christians to the death. I stood by and watched and held the coats of those who stoned Stephen to death. You don't like Romans 7, he says, wretched man that I am, right? All the translations, Bible translations use the present tense. Paul looks at what he did and who he was, and I think Paul would say, I'm the Christian alcoholic. Yeah. I'm the one who did all that stuff, and I never want to forget it. And not only do I not want to forget it, I don't want you to forget it, because what I see in Jesus is that he works through people like me and you and us, and he takes those testimonies and weaknesses, and that's where he shines. And then the second person would be Matthew. And so Brennan Manning, who wrote the Ragamuffin Gospel, who was a very famous Christian alcoholic himself, he says, if you look at the Gospels, Mark, Luke, and John, whenever they talk about Matthew, they talk about Matthew, right? But Matthew, in his own gospel, when he talks about himself, he calls himself and calls out Matthew, the publican, Matthew, the tax collector, right? And you know this, Trey, but like tax collectors were bottom of the barrel. Like they were traitors. They were not only helping persecute their fellow person, but they were making money off of it, right? And so Matthew is always like, listen, you need to understand how low Jesus stooped to rescue me, right? And so when I use the term alcoholic, that's part of like what I'm trying to say is, no, you don't realize how bad it got that Jesus had to rescue me, not just once, but over and over and over again.
Well, I mean, that's the story of the gospel from Genesis to Revelation. That's the story of Christ, of God redeeming us and us straying away and wandering away, and then having to be brought back to the main thing, which is fixing our hearts and our minds and our eyes on Christ. So yeah, I think that's a powerful reminder. Everybody stick with us. We're going to fit in another quick break. We'll be right back with more Faith and Culture. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. We're talking with Jon Seidl about his new book, Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic. Jon, as we're kind of closing out our conversation here, for somebody who's listening to this episode, and we have a longer conversation to the Faith and Culture podcast, so be sure to check that out. But Jon, just quickly here, what would your encouragement be to somebody who is dealing with their own struggle with addiction?
So I think the main point that I want people to take from this is that you do not stop sinning when you become a Christian, right? That sanctification, that process of becoming more like Jesus starts the day that you accept Jesus. I say, listen, salvation is a lifeline, but sanctification is a lifetime. And I think the devil wants us to heap shame on ourselves and say, you're supposed to be perfect. You're supposed to be perfect. Or you at least can't struggle with the big things. You can struggle with the little things, but you can't struggle with the big things. And listen, that's not an excuse. That's not like, Romans 6, Paul talks about this. That's not an excuse to abuse grace. You can't sin so grace abounds more. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I am talking about is the fact that like we are always constantly, John Owen, the Puritan preacher, said we need to be killing sin or sin will be killing us. And we will never run out of sins to kill, right? So my encouragement to people is understand that sanctification process makes room for what I call messy sanctification, right? And the truth is we are all addicted to something. And so I John Calvin said our hearts are idol factories, right?
Yeah.
We are always making idols in our hearts. And so the moment you take one off, another one's going to start to creep in. So my encouragement is don't get discouraged by the fact that you continue to have things to work on. That's the Christian life, right? And if it is one of those quote unquote big sins, is that God's grace is sufficient and it makes room for forgiveness for that. Does there need to be repentance, Trey? Absolutely, right? Could there be consequences for your actions? Yes, there could be, right? But the good news is that God's grace has covered it all.
Yeah. Amen to that. Well, the book is Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic, a candid conversation on drinking, addiction, and how to break free. You can get that now wherever you get your books. Jon Seidl, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Trey.
All right, everybody, stick with us. We'll be right back to wrap up this week's episode. That is all the time we have for this week's Faith and Culture. If you want an extended version of our conversation with Jon Seidl, check out the Faith and Culture podcast. You can get that wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you so much for being here, and God bless you.